be joining us, and I know a number of folks are also wanting to see a live recording or a recording of this, and so we'll share that as well for those of you who want to share with your colleagues who were unable to join us for this presentation. And so don't worry, this will be shared as well. I'm going to provide some quick housekeeping and then hands off to the CAT Chair-elect Robert Glazer. And so for housekeeping, again, this is our fifth in a monthly series regarding our CAT webinars. Looking forward to the time when we can meet in person, but for the time being, this has been a really informative and fruitful journey. And so we're glad that you've been a part of this with us. Again, the webinars will be available via recording. And I just want to put a quick plug that we'll have one last webinar this year later in November, I believe the 12th. And I'll be sending you details about that. And that will be a legislative advocacy webinar where we'll be discussing our advocacy efforts at the state legislature for the upcoming session. And so stay tuned for those details. And so with that said, let me hand off to Robert Glazer to provide some introductory remarks. Robert.
Thank you, Manny. I appreciate it. And thank you for putting this all together. Again, my name is Robert Glazer. I'm chair-elect of the Community College Association of Texas Trustees, and I'm a trustee at Houston Community College. I want to thank all of you for joining us today for our webinar, Strengthening Rural Community Colleges, a presentation led by our colleagues at the Association of Community College Trustees. Over the past 18 months, ACCT has conducted a comprehensive assessment of the assets of rural community colleges throughout the country. According to the U.S. Department of Education, there are over 260 rural community colleges in the United States that educate nearly 670,000 students a year. In addition to offering educational opportunities and vocational training, these rural institutions often represent the largest employer in their communities. In order to best serve the colleges and their students, it is critical that we understand their success and their challenges and develop policy solutions to support rural institutions and their communities in achieving academic and economic prosperity. During this webinar, G. Hang Lee and Rachel Rush-Marlowe from ACCT will provide context for this work and share preliminary findings based off their national stakeholder interviews and surveys. But before we get started, let me introduce our speakers. G. Hang Lee is the Senior Vice President for ACCT. Mr. Lee heads ACCT's Government Affairs Office. Working with other higher education organizations and state organizations, Mr. Lee advocates on behalf of community college boards and colleges on legislative and regulatory issues such as appropriations, student financial aid, tax policy, and higher education policy. Lee holds a master's degree in political management from George Washington University and a bachelor's degree in political science from Boston University. Rachel Rush-Marlowe is a senior program manager at ACCT and serves as the research lead on ACCT's Strengthening Rural Community Colleges Research Initiative. Prior to working at ACCT, Ms. Rush-Marlowe most recently worked at the National Student Clearinghouse, where she served as a research analyst. Ms. Rush-Marlowe holds a master's degree in public policy analysis from Georgetown University and a bachelor's degree in international relations from Syracuse University. Again, thank you for joining us today, and I will hand it off to the ACC team.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much to Kat and also our friends at TAC for their participation and support of this project. Christy, is this PowerPoint showing right now? So we can go through the PowerPoint?
Not yet.
Okay.
I think Rachel is going to do the PowerPoint.
Okay, perfect. So as Robert and Manny mentioned, ACCT last August received a grant from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to support a project called Strengthening Rural Community Colleges. As many of you know, due to a number of factors, including population loss, disinvestment in public education, and other factors, many of our rural communities have been suffering and have experienced funding loss through the past several years. As part of our effort from the Gates Foundation, we were tasked to do 3 specific things as part of our project. Number one, we're supposed to convene trustees, presidents, and community stakeholders. As we all know, community stakeholders are an important component to rural communities. We were also supposed to take a look and research the needs of facing our communities, from financial to other type of areas where our communities have explicit needs. And we're also supposed to advocate and also create policy recommendations at the federal level and state level so that we can affect change in Washington and also in state capitals. Okay. As part of our effort and the size of the grant, we were unable to do all 50 states as part of our project. But working with the foundation, we were able to target 5 specific states. Those states from east to west are North Carolina, Kentucky, Iowa, Texas, and California. Obviously, from our broad perspective as a membership organization, we have a good mix of appointed states at the statewide level and also at the regional level, but also elected states such as Iowa, Texas, and California, elected boards. So we have a very unique look into each of those 5 states. I will mention, as part of our project, one of the things we were supposed to do was convene, and we've had to convene virtually. I think Manny knows this because we work with Manny and Jacob to create a whole schedule of activities and times to come out and visit Texas, and especially eat some Texas barbecue. Unfortunately, the pandemic has largely sidelined our travel for 2020 starting in March. So that's something that hopefully when we do travel, we can visit all of you again soon. So as part of our effort, one of the things that that we have experienced is just even having a difficulty defining what a rural community is. So that was one of our major efforts, is to take a look at the definitions, take a look at some of the challenges that are currently in place within the federal government and also state agency structures, and then also talk a little bit about some of the strengths of our communities. As Robert mentioned, our institutions, for the most part, are one of the leading employers in many of our communities. And so therefore, as the leading employer, you have a significant amount of sway. And you are also the leading workforce education provider in many of our rural communities. So therefore, you are the pipeline for many of our business partners. So just briefly, as I mentioned, in August, we received these funds from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Our task was to create this type of timeline. You'll see here, October 2019 to December, we're work on some research methodology. January to August of this year, we were supposed to do field work, interviews and convenings. That actually has slipped a little bit, and so we're still doing a couple interviews, but as Rachel always says, we're done at the end of October. So, and then October to January 21, we are in the midst of report writing and also creating some policy recommendations to the federal government and also to states as they think about these significant issues for our institutions. And we expect to have a report publication in spring of 2021. We are aiming to release in February of 2021, but it may leak into March of 21. So just some additional information for all of you. When I mentioned the convenings, just, you know, we've been asking trustees, presidents, community stakeholders, legislators, administration officials, agency officials to provide us some information about some of the challenges that our institutions are facing. We're also trying to increase public awareness around these issues, and then ultimately, like I mentioned, develop these policy solutions to support long-term viability of our institutions. Okay. As I mentioned, one of the things that we were supposed to do is research the idea of what it means to be rural. And as we start rolling through some of these, you'll see kind of the diversity of opinions on what rural means. And, and then from there, we'll have more of a substantive conversation. So currently right now, there are over 75 definitions of what rural means. These are some of the descriptions that are currently in place for many different agencies. So any place with fewer than 50,000 inhabitants, any place with 10,000 or fewer inhabitants, areas with a population density between 7 and 1,000 people per square mile, any place fewer than 5,000 inhabitants, any populated area with boundaries of at least 40 miles apart, which is not contiguous to a large urban area and considered rural in character. So before I begin to the next slide, there's a wide discrepancy in all of those descriptions. And I think what we can say to all of you is, hopefully many of you who are listening to this conversation, or if you're in a rural community, I wonder if any of these apply to you. And also, I also wonder what I don't necessarily know what rural in character means, but these are all the definitions that are currently in place in the federal government. And we would like to have a more uniform description of what a rural community college or rural community looks like. Next slide. So in Texas, actually, while Texas is large, it does not have as many different definitions of rural as the federal government. It only has 46 definitions of rural. These are some of the definitions that are placed within rural counties. So rural county means a county with a population of less than 50. Rural county means a population less than 60. A rural county means a county that has a population of not more than 125. A rural county means a county that is outside the boundary, primarily metropolitan statistical area or metropolitan statistical area. I think what I can say to you is, I think looking at these definitions, you can, I think there is a significant difference between 50 and 125 for a county. I wouldn't say you need uniformity, but some type of a more one size or maybe a handful size would be better than having 46 definitions across all various agencies. So in terms of rural, what a rural community college looks like from the U.S. Department of Education, this is the current definition of a rural community college in the Department of Education. So when you look at and go to visit, for example, the College Navigator on the U.S. Department of Education's website, you can look at the classification of your institution. So you could be an urban institution, suburban institution, rural institution, town institution. But this is a definition of a rural remote community college. It has to be, and this is the main campus of a community college, no more than 25 miles from an urbanized area, population of 50,000 or greater, and more than 10 miles from an urban cluster, population of 2,500 to 50,000. So before we get to the next slide, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Rachel, who's been our primary researcher, and she's been doing the lion's share of the interviews. So as the participants on this call, I want you to think about whether or not you consider your institutions in this category. And this is a trick question. I want you to think about the number of institutions in the state of Texas, community colleges that fit this bill. And we will give bonus points to individuals if they can name the institutions that are in this category. So if you can think about it, we're going to give you a couple minutes. We're going to give you about 30 seconds, and then I'm going to turn it over to Rachel, and she's going to go to the next slide, and hopefully all of you get a passing grade. Okay.
Thank you, Jihang. And I'll clarify too, so that we can ensure that people are most likely to get full credit. So this is, as Jihang mentioned, the definition of rural remote. So to further complicate things within the Department of Education, there are actually 3 different tiers of rurality. So this is the most remote. So there are some that are can be slightly farther away, or sorry, slightly closer to these urbanized areas and urban clusters, and still be considered rural. However, it's still a fairly restrictive definition. Manny has heard this line many times through the interviews that we've conducted, and I think I see a few familiar names. So you may have heard this from me as well, but I actually grew up in very rural communities in New England, and we lived in a community of 3,000 people. So, when I first started engaging in this research, to learn that there are communities and community colleges that are designated as such based on distance from, a community like where I grew up, which was designated as, an urban cluster, is really quite silly. Jihang mentioned one of the definitions talks about rural character, and I think I have a pretty good sense of what that is. It's hard to define, it when you see it, but we didn't have any stoplights, we didn't have many paved roads, maybe more cows than people. And to think that a community college's designation as rural or not would be dependent on their distance from us as an urban center, I think really highlights some of the challenges in the federal definitions that we're examining. So I'll move to the next slide now, and I hope you have your numbers ready as to whether or not you think your institution is rural and how many you think there are. So as per this definition that we just reviewed, these are the 5 colleges in the state of Texas that are designated as rural by the Department of Education. And so this is certainly, I think, an undercount. I imagine that many of you feel similarly. And this is really foundational to the work that we're doing. Through the work that we've been doing in these interviews and through this research, we recognize that our colleges face a great number of challenges in rural areas, and we're not going to be able to advocate for resources and get institutions the assistance that they need to deal with these challenges if we can't all agree on who you all are. So this is a huge part of the work, and we recognize that there is no one perfect definition. I think that's evidenced by the hundreds that are in existence already. But we would certainly like to elevate knowledge around the challenges of the current one, why it's incomplete, and try to move towards some flexibility in building a better definition that suits the needs of our colleges. What's changed? So as we talk about this research, as Jihang mentioned, we started this project before the pandemic, and now we're in the midst of the pandemic. So I wanted to take a little time to talk about how some of our priorities and our research has shifted. We are certainly living in a very different world than we were just a few months ago, and we want our research to be reflective of that. A huge part of this endeavor is, again, to advocate for the needs of our rural colleges, and so we want this advocacy and this research to be reflective of the actual context and the situation that's happening at our of all colleges right now. So just from a logistics standpoint, of course, we are no longer doing site visits. We were very disappointed. Our first trip that was canceled was actually to Austin, and we were down to the wire in deciding whether or not we were going to fly out. But we did have the opportunity to make trips to California, Iowa, and Kentucky before the whole world went online. Oops, sorry, I tried to open the questions, and let me get this back. And so we've, of course, switched, to a more virtual format now, of course, doing these interviews. But the main issue, in all of this is, of course, not our research. Again, the focus is always for us on the colleges, and we recognize that COVID-19 has had a huge impact, particularly on our rural communities and our rural colleges. And so we want to be really cognizant of that. And that's had a huge impact in the research and the priorities that we've been hearing. So we'll dive in a little bit to the data and what we've been hearing from our institutions in a moment. In addition to COVID-19, we've also heard quite a shift in some of the priorities of our institutions following the renewed energy around Black Lives Matter and the protests over the summer. Many of our institutions are now thinking about what it means to serve all students. And how they can do that in their rural communities to recruit and retain diverse faculty that have an understanding of student needs. So that's been something that has come up more recently. Again, with COVID-19 and the many changes it has brought, some of the advocacy and support strategies that we put together in the early spring are no longer necessarily relevant. And so, as Jihang mentioned, our timeline has shifted a little because we want to ensure that the issues that we're highlighting are reflective of the current situation. So to that end, I'm going to focus on a few different specific issues that we've heard a lot about and then get into some of the data from our interviews. So of course, amidst a pandemic, the first thing that comes to mind is healthcare. Prior to the pandemic and the interviews that we were able to conduct, there were conversations around rural healthcare access, but these were much more focused around education and programming. So it wasn't necessarily as much focused on the actual ability to access care, but rather colleges were worried about their students and their ability to get the training that they needed. Without hospitals in the area, it was difficult for students to train in their field of interest and get experience. We learned many of our colleges were dealing with that issue by creating supplemental resources on campus through virtual programs, medical dummies, and things of that sort. But of course, this is expensive as well. And so there's sort of a trade-off there between investing in more expensive resources and finding alternatives through transportation or other creative partnerships to get students the experience in hospitals. While that issue certainly hasn't gone away, it's been, I would say, deprioritized in our conversations around healthcare. And of course, now the focus is much more around access to care that people in the community need as a result of COVID-19. Many of our trustees shared with us that in their rural communities, they've been lucky to see numbers quite low. Their communities haven't been quite as hard hit. However, this has also changed people's behavior, and so people might not be acting as risk averse, and a few of our trustees noted that they were really concerned for the future because you know, they were very fortunate thus far, but were COVID to hit their community harder, you know, many don't have hospitals. And in one of the places we spoke to a trustee who said, you know, they're very fortunate that they do have a local hospital, but their hospital is equipped with just one ventilator. And so were the situation to worsen, things will be very difficult for them to provide care for their community. As a result of this, we've seen that our communities are relying on our colleges more than ever before. And in the state of California, for example, one of our rural colleges has been set up as a federal medical center. So their gym has been completely converted. And we recognize that this has been a huge burden on our colleges as well, as they are, of course, eager to help the community and support in this really difficult time. However, it's forced them to also deprioritize you know, what were previously really important student needs. Conversations around childcare, of course, were important before the pandemic and remain important today, but these have shifted a little bit as well. Prior to the pandemic, conversations were much more focused around affordability and distance of care. And today it's really just about the existence of care or lack thereof. Many of our students we know are parents and are working from home, which provides challenges, having students in the house with their children, as I'm sure some of you are also feeling that. But we know that many of our students are also essential workers and so are back at work in person, despite the fact that many childcare options have not found a way to safely reopen. And of course, we can't talk about the pandemic without talking about broadband. With much of the world online today, this has been a huge challenge for our institutions. Rural broadband was really at the forefront of our research even before the pandemic, but of course, this has just been exacerbated as courses, work, and many other things have moved online. In Texas in particular, in our interviews with some organizations involved in rural broadband, we also learned about some additional challenges as it relates to the accessibility of federal resources. So unfortunately, fortunately, both the FCC and USDA have grant opportunities to expand and provide rural broadband. Often this occurs in partnership with community colleges. Unfortunately, the two grants in theory should be complementary as they provide different types of service and help supplement funding for different stages of infrastructure. Unfortunately, a few of our colleges learned that application and receipt of one grant excludes you from eligibility for the other. And so we spoke to a lot of institutions and communities that had some success in getting some funding, getting some infrastructure in place, but were unable to complete projects to actually provide service to the community. Another really unfortunate practice that we learned about as it relates to federal grant application is that there have been some cases in Texas of subpar private providers applying for federal grant funding on behalf of the community without the support or collaboration or even communication with the community. So one institution that we spoke to was attempting to apply for an FCC grant to try to provide service to their community, and through that application process learned that their community had already received funding. And this funding was applied for and received by a private satellite provider that unfortunately did not actually provide adequate service for the community. But because they had received that grant, the community was ineligible for further grants of that kind. So this is something that really caught our attention as we recognize that federal grant applications are already very challenging. You know, the definitional issue about rural being just one of those problems. And so this is something that we really want to try to make progress on through this work. So as I mentioned before, we did do some interviews back in February before the pandemic hit. And so just have some comparison data here of how priorities have changed. So as I mentioned, broadband was and remains a high priority issue. But prior to the pandemic, we had around 50% of participants noting that as one of the greatest challenges facing their community or their college. And now we have over 80% of participants responding in that way. Recruitment and retention of staff is something that has also come up a lot, but these numbers have actually shrunk a little bit since the pandemic. And in some of our interviews in Texas as well, we learned about some institutions that are actually taking advantage of the new digital learning environment in areas that are fortunate enough to have consistent access to broadband. We're hearing that some institutions are using this digital learning platform as an opportunity to recruit faculty and staff from outside of their region, and using that as a way to kind of fill positions that they might not have otherwise had such success in doing so because they no longer had to require people to relocate. We also saw that since the pandemic, basic needs has become a higher priority issue for many of our institutions. So moving forward through this work, as Jiheng mentioned, we are really interested in making a direct impact and finding ways that we can support our colleges. So as part of the rollout of this report, which hopefully will be in February of 2021, we'll be holding an interagency discussion at our National Legislative Summit. So we're hoping to bring together representatives from different federal agencies that are interested in supporting our rural colleges and having an open discussion with them about ways that we can better facilitate these resources. We've been contacted and had quite a lot of success in outreach to federal agencies. And we've heard a whole range of things from them, from, you know, that institutions aren't applying for the funding that's available, or, you know, they're applying, but there seems to be some hiccups in the process. And so we're really interested in bringing everyone together to the table to facilitate this process. We know that, you know, in many cases, the resources aren't available, but in many cases there are resources available, and we want to make sure that if that money is on the table, that it can actually get to the institutions that need it. We're hopeful that in publishing the report in February, we'll be able to leverage some policy priorities, kind of take advantage of that window within the first 100 days of either a new administration or a continuation of the current one, and the fact that we'll be entering a new congressional session. So would like to be able to get this in front of people at the federal level and really reinforce what a priority our rural colleges are. At the state level, we've been having meetings with governor's offices and state legislators, and so we hope as well that this report will be a tool for you all to use in advocacy at the state level, especially given that we've already met with a number of these people, and so we're hopeful that in engaging and including them in the process, they'll be more receptive and understanding when this report comes out, and to be able to use that to sort of advocate for your needs. And then as well, in the report, we'll be including state profiles that have a little bit more detail and contextual information about each of the states that we've worked in, highlighting some really unique partnerships and case studies of best practice. So it's really easy, I think, when we talk about rural communities to paint this narrative of despair, and that's not the case. We know that our rural colleges are strong and nimble, and they've always done so much more with less. And so we want to highlight these success stories as well, while also recognizing that this shouldn't have to be the case. Nimble and quick to adjust and spreading every last dollar are all these types of phrases that we hear quite a bit. And while we know that our rural colleges are great at it, we're hopeful for something better. So we want to highlight these wonderful programs that have been occurring thus far as an opportunity for other states to perhaps see a model for that, while also advocating for more. And so here we will be providing this presentation, of course, and actually each of these federal resources are links to the program page. So once you have the presentation yourself, you can click and look into these if you're interested. So I just wanted to include a few programs that we've been learning more about and working with that are very receptive to and interested in engaging more with our rural colleges. So the USDA provides community facilities, direct loans, and grants. I also included some information about the Department of Education C-Campus program. Applications for C-Campus have actually closed for this round, but wanted to include it as something to keep in mind in the future, especially given how many of our institutions in rural communities brought up that they would love to be able to provide childcare on campus for their students, but didn't really know where to get started. And so there is funding available for that. And then also the National Science Foundation's Project Vision. So, we acknowledge that there are huge barriers to federal grant application. And so this is actually a project to help facilitate that process and provide colleges with the resources as well as some contacts, professional development opportunities, and someone to get in touch with who'll regularly work with your institution to discover opportunities to match ideas that you have on campus to further NSF funding. And so with that, I think we'll open it up to questions. I can turn it over to Jiheng if you want to add any last remarks, or Manny.
So thank you very much, Rachel and Jiheng, for that presentation. We'll open it up for questions, and I will start with a couple that I know that I've gained over the course of participating in the interviews, at least with the Texas delegates, and I think have been very informative. One of the things I'm curious about, now that you all have done a number of interviews, not just in Texas, but across the country at the 5 states that you've been working with, is there anything that's surprising to you all in terms of that you've discovered through your investigation, whether it was a misperception, whether a surprise, in terms of new efforts that are being successfully launched? I mean, what all have you learned? And again, maybe learned is not a good definition, because you all are learning a lot through this process. But if you had to kind of identify one surprise, could you do that?
Rachel, why don't you start, and then I have one. So.
All right. So there are 2 actually, I think, that are, probably won't be any surprise to anyone on this call either, given what we shared about rurality. But I was really shocked to see, so many different definitions. And I think to see the way that they're laid out as well is really problematic. The US Department of Agriculture within that department has many definitions, but those are generally very specific. And so when I started learning about that, that made a lot of sense to me that, if you're applying for a grant for a rural water program, the definition should be based on what kind of infrastructure you have in place. If it's related to farming, maybe looking at percentage of agriculture in a community. But to see so many definitions that are solely based on population size and that no two of those are in agreement is really just troublesome. And I think outside of that, one thing that I've learned that's, I don't know if it's encouraging or discouraging, but I think just again, kind of going back to what we talked about around opportunities in federal resources, I think there's a perception that the money is not there, that they're, not everything is about money, but it certainly helps, right, in getting our rural colleges some of the resources that they need. And I think there's a perception that the dollars aren't available. And the good news is that they are. The bad news is that, there clearly isn't appropriate outreach from the federal level. There's not awareness on campuses about what's available and how to get it. And in cases where there is awareness about how to get it, there are just a number of other barriers. And so I think that was surprising in some ways, but has really helped us forge our path in recognizing what we need to do in helping make those dollars more accessible.
Yeah, I would say one of the issues that has come up in a number of our conversations and our interviews is around mental health. A large number of our communities are suffering through, like Iowa had, a weather situation where vast crop areas were devastated. We have, in the state of Wisconsin, we were alerted to the fact that the suicide rates amongst farmers was at the highest in the country. So many of our rural communities have significant mental health needs. And I think that is one area that we do think is important, because especially since ACCT has done work around basic needs, including mental health. I would also flag for all of you is we have a website called NOW, it's now.acct.org. We actually have an op-ed that was written by Dr. Tom Perkins, who's one of our trustees from Western Nebraska Community College, the very western part of the state. It's very rural. He is actually the trustee there, but also he is, I think he's in the social work. So therefore, this is something that he sees on a continual basis. And I encourage you to take a look at that article that was written.
Drop a link to that in the chat.
Yeah, and so thank you both for that. Our next question, Rachel answered it, but I want to ask it again just so that maybe you get your thoughts, Jihang. It's from a colleague of mine from grad school, Tara Holman, who I believe is from White House, Texas, so a very small town right outside of Tyler, which technically I guess would not be considered rural if we're using one of those definitions, but his question is about definitions in rural. And I know that we had one college president say, I don't know if I had the definition, but I know it when I see it. And so is there though, while that's helpful in conversation, that doesn't necessarily help in terms of research and institutions seeking out grant funding. And anyways, long way to get to it, but is there a certain combination of definitions that you all at ACCT are advocating for, or feel best represents kind of what being rural means in not just Texas, but across America?
Yeah, I'll have Rachel answer this, but it will be a mixture of measurements in all likelihood. I don't think there's candidly any silver bullet that will cure all the agency's definitional problem.
Absolutely. So yeah, I think to Jihang's point, there is no silver bullet. A few different things that we are taking into consideration right now. The first is kind of the simplest, and that's something that we've seen from a lot of our partner organizations and DC-based research orgs. Traditionally, will include all of the institutions that are designated as town by the Department of Education, as that kind of, again, it's, you sort of know it when you see it, but if you go through the list and do a comparison of who's included in that group versus just rural, I think it comes much closer. Again, it has a lot of problems within that definition, but it's a good proxy as a sort of short-term solution. In the long term, one thing that we're considering as part of this work is proposing something similar to the HSI waiver. And so institutions that are interested in federal funding that don't necessarily qualify or meet the qualifications of a Hispanic serving institution can fill out a waiver form that has a number of different items that they can kind of check off. And if they meet those, then they'll be reconsidered. And so this was actually proposed to us by a trustee to do something similar, because as we've discussed on this call, what it means to be rural is so nuanced. And what it means to be rural in Texas doesn't necessarily look like Iowa or California. And so proposing, one single all-encompassing all-encompassing definition would be, I think, nearly impossible. So rather than try to do that, to come up with a sort of checklist of things that if you meet 3 of 5 or 2 of 5, that you could be included there. And those items for the checklist are still things that we're kind of talking through, but I think a lot of the conversations that we've had with interviewees have focused around things like access to broadband, population density, access to healthcare and other basic infrastructure, ambulatory or even grocery stores, things like that.
Thank you both. And again, if y'all have any questions, please feel free to type them into the chat and I will share those with our panelists. I have another question, and this is, the elephant in the room in many regards, but, we're talking about higher education. It's hard to ignore that funding is a big question mark in many regards in terms of what our community colleges and four-year institutions, to be quite frank, are going to be seeing moving forward in a post-pandemic, mid-pandemic world that we're living in. Can you speak to some of the funding challenges that you're seeing, not just in Texas, but across the country? Again, understanding that the way Texas funds community colleges will be different than way Iowa or California. And I think this is something that would be very enlightening. Again, understanding that our enrollments across the sector are down 9%. And what does that mean in terms of the funding that community colleges can expect? And what does that mean for the institutions as they try to serve not just student needs, but community needs?
Many thanks. We at ACCT have been leading an effort with the American Association of Community Colleges to get additional stimulus funds for higher education institutions, especially public institutions. We think it's critical. This current pandemic period has created all sorts of enrollment fluctuation especially for two-year public institutions, but also have caused decreases in state funding for community colleges. So there are a couple states when the first stimulus, the CARES Act, was distributed to institutions. All of our community colleges in the state of Texas receive funds, 50% for institutional use and 50% for students. What we did see in some states is, for an example, in New York, they actually cut state allocations to community colleges based upon what they received in the CARES Act. Obviously, that's a zero-sum game, and what we are working to do with organizations like the National Governors Association, which represents all the governors in the country, is to get some state and local funding. We know that even if we are able to get additional aid for institutions like was in the CARES Act, it's not going to be enough if states aren't supported. And if states aren't supported, they'll essentially cut your funding based upon what the federal government provides to all of you. So if your institution gets $2 million, your state will likely cut your allocation by $2 million. We've seen it, it occurred in Michigan and other states. So we're hyper attuned to that activity. And so therefore we are continuing to push for additional stimulus dollars for our institutions and also for states. Our estimation is that sometime after the election, I think Congress will start to work diligently on trying to get a stimulus legislation. I believe that if President Trump is elected, that stimulus legislation will occur quickly after November. And so therefore be passed prior to the beginning of the new year. And if Vice President Biden is elected, I believe they'll probably wait till January to move that piece of legislation and have him sign it sometime when he is inaugurated. You all see the marketplace right now. The stock market has been hemorrhaging because of the lack of a stimulus legislation and the increased number of individuals that have contracted COVID. I don't perceive that it will get better until additional resources are sent down to localities and states. And I would also just say that the enrollment loss in our community colleges right now is by far the largest of any of the public sectors and even the private not-for-profits. So it is, the additional resources are critical for our institutions.
And I would add to that as well from more of a state perspective. You know, we've seen each of the 5 states that we've been working in have slightly different funding formulas. You know, no two are exactly the same, but I think across all of our interviews, I don't think we've spoken to anyone, you know, within rural communities who feels that the funding formula is fair for rural colleges. You know, certainly at the federal level, ACCT has been very engaged in trying to get more resources allocated to community colleges in general. But I think at the state level, the funding mechanisms really disadvantage rural colleges, sort of regardless of the system. So Texas, I've been learning about the taxing districts and a lot about how that works. And that seems to be a huge problem for our rural communities and colleges that serve a lot of districts that are not taxing districts. The state of California is very different. Their funding formula is per head. And so this can cause, and as I believe Jihan, keep me honest, is done in arrears, which makes it very difficult.
Yeah, deferments.
Yeah, that's the word. Makes it difficult for planning and also doesn't allow any base allocation. And so our California colleges really struggle with this because there's no sort of set amount of dollars allocated just to keeping the doors open. And so at our very small colleges, you know, a loss of 10 students in a year can have a dramatic impact on funding.
Thank you both for sharing that perspective on not just the, you know, kind of national trends that you're seeing in terms of other states, explaining how other states are, you know, I guess also dealing with their own funding challenges, but also providing that federal insight with regards to what to expect with, you know, the upcoming election outcomes coming up in about a week. A couple of questions have come in. Will part of your work be to develop best practices for different issues such as teacher retention and or attraction?
Rachel, do you want to talk a little bit about how we're going to be utilizing our website, Rural Community College website? I think she might be frozen. So we will actually have, as part of our work, we're going to actually be utilizing a website where we'll have, you can actually see how institutions are defined in terms of the rurality or their urbanicity. So that's going to be something we're going to be doing. We're going to also be doing 5 state profiles. That'll have information about some of the things, interesting things that our institutions are doing in each of the 5 states that might serve as a best practice for institutions. So we will be highlighting all of that, not necessarily in the report because we want the report to actually be readable. We tend not to have humongous reports, but we'll be utilizing a website to feature each of the 5 target states.
Thank you. So another question came in. Not sure who or what agencies are attempting to develop more clear and useful definitions of rural colleges. This is coming from Raymond Lewis of Galveston College. From my understanding, that there is no centralized effort, and that's part of the reason why the work that ACCT is tackling this is critical and imperative, because really wanting to start the conversation with whether it's a new administration that comes in January, or kicking off this second term of Donald Trump if he's reelected. And so, not to speak for ACCT, but Jihang, is that correct?
Yeah, that is correct. We're trying to flag a significant issue for the federal government and for state agencies, and I think that is really important.
Another question, any opinions as to why community college enrollment is down to the degrees reported? Again, I know oftentimes we talk about how during times of economic recession, typically you see community college enrollments go up because of the need or interest in reskilling or upskilling. And so, I think some people are very surprised to see enrollments, across the country actually being reported a 9% decrease if we're using National Clearinghouse data. Can you kind of touch on your thoughts there, Jihang?
Yeah, in terms of the clearinghouse data, I think, we're very concerned about the enrollment loss at our institutions, especially in an economic downturn. What the numbers kind of that we are seeing, and many of our institutions are flagging for us, the largest percentage drop of individuals at many of our institutions have been men, especially men of color. I think that is something that is important, and I think a lot of colleges, if that is something trustees in this room that are participating, and the presidents who are, I see a couple of presidents that are on this call. These are conversations you should have with your registrar's office. Who is not coming back to your institution? And there should be some intentionality of, reaching out to these students who are not returning to ask why they're not returning. The other, the reality of this current situation is, I am, although today I'm in the office, I am home with 2 children and my wife, who we're all Zooming and all at the same time. It is typically not conducive to, additional work and, just managing my children's schedule. So many independent students, those are the individuals primarily, parents, they are foregoing college because the reality is it's already hard enough to be working and managing your own child's educational platform, to then trying to figure out how you take classes on top of work and managing a household. So the current pandemic period is substantially different than what we saw in 2008, 2009, 2010. And I imagine that, when things start to open up again and schools are more in person throughout the country, you will see some swing back with enrollments, especially at our institutions. That being said, what we experienced through this current pandemic of online education, and institutions are going to have to work on supporting everyone, not even just your students. I know many rural community colleges, especially when they first went virtual, it wasn't just the students that they needed to provide technology and hotspots to. They needed to provide that technology to faculty. They need to provide that to administrators and staff. And so I think this current situation just kind of highlighted some of the needs that our institutions needed to kind of work on. And we're hopeful that the CARES Act supported that endeavor for our institutions.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I would add to that as well. I don't have any, this is really just anecdotal, but as far as it relates back to enrollment declines at our rural colleges, one thing that was very striking to me through the course of our interviews, especially those prior to the pandemic, was the importance of in-person and on-campus interaction in terms of bringing students in. And so in a lot of rural communities, especially in our conversations in Kentucky and Iowa, we heard from college presidents and trustees that were regularly hosting different types of events on campus to draw people in, and really noted the importance of just getting people to campus and getting comfortable feeling that they could come to a college campus. So hosting drive-in movie nights and things like that, and then kind of throughout the evening going around and speaking to the members of the community that had come on campus, but also through K-12 partnerships, kind of having days where students could come and visit the college, just really having that in-person interaction and bringing people to the college to make them feel like they belonged, is something that a lot of our trustees highlighted as being very important, as well as, the ability to recruit in person at football games and churches and other kinds of gathering places in rural communities. And we know that those interactions are so much more difficult now. And so that's something that we've been asking about too, kind of moving forward, how colleges are getting around that. And one thing that we've heard from some of our trustees in Texas as well is that kind of adding a sort of layers of networks. And so trustees have been reaching out to other community leaders. Jihang mentioned the African-American male students. We've seen huge declines. And so, one of our trustees talked about reaching out to a community member who was much more in touch with that community and working through them to kind of reach their community members in that way. We've also heard from some of our trustees that they really feel the best way to get that interaction and that sort of communication out, that this can be a place for you, has been to use other student voices. And so, even if it's on Zoom, they've found it very powerful to have their current students talking about the experience and trying to reach out to other people that they know who might be interested in going back to school. So these are some of the things that we've heard, especially as the enrollment declines relate to our rural colleges.
Well, and thank you both for that insight. And I want to be mindful of everyone's time. We're reaching about that hour. And so any last words or remarks before, we wrap up and provide some kind of final remarks for upcoming webinars?
I would just say thanks to Kat and TAC for your continued support for the project. And we couldn't have done this work, especially in this remote fashion, without your support in the past several months. The membership, we serve two memberships, your membership, and then we always have the national membership. We think it's important to maintain strong ties with both associations.
Yeah, thank you so much.
And thank you both. You all have been excellent partners. We always appreciate the work that you all do at the National Association and bringing the trustee community together. Looking forward to the time where we can meet in person. Don't know when that's going to start. Looking forward to when we can host you all, because I feel like you all missed on the Texas experience. We have plenty of locations, not just for barbecue, but for tacos as well. Again, we can have an entire webinar on those conversations as well. And so thank you both, Jihang and Rachel, and your teams for helping with this effort. And we will share information regarding not just this webinar, but that future publication when it becomes ready and available. Again, thank you all for joining us. I want to share one more plug for our upcoming November webinar, where we will be talking about legislative advocacy for our trustees and presidents when it comes time to meet down in Austin or virtually with the upcoming session. And so until then, we will keep you posted, but hopefully you all have a great rest of your week and weekend, and we look forward to seeing you at the next one. Y'all take care. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Manny.
Thank you.
Thank you, Robert.